Guten Tag, Kinder. Welcome to the Composer Detective, where we investigate the lives and the music of some of the world's great and influential composers. I am your guide, George Frideric Handel. Today, I would like to introduce you to the orchestral periods. We already learned that an orchestra is a union of instruments which must include stringed instruments. There are four main groups of instruments in the orchestra: the strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. The orchestra came about in the early 1600s. Before that, instrumental music occurred in small ensembles or groups of instruments. In the 1600s, the harpsichord, which is a keyboard instrument like the piano, except the strings are plucked, was very popular. You know, I played the harpsichord. So an orchestra, or union of instruments, formed with the harpsichord at the center, and the harpsichord player would direct the other players when to come in and as to tempo or speed of the piece. There were also string instruments, such as a handful of violins, a couple violas, a couple celli, and a double bass. There was also an oboe, flute, and trumpet. This was the Baroque era, that is, the period of history from the mid-1600s to the mid-1700s, in which music is characterized by emotional, flowery, and ornamented sounds written within very strict forms. You might say it is an almost frivolous use of frills, trills, and extra notes, so it sounded grand, fancy, and decorated. Next came the classical era. This is a period of music history from the mid-1700s to the early 1800s. Music of this time was very structured and orderly, and you could say it was sparer and more emotionally reserved than music of the Baroque and Romantic periods. The size of the orchestra grew during the classical era. The harpsichord was no longer at the center, and the orchestra now had a conductor, someone who helped keep the beat of the music and gave direction for dynamics and expression when certain instruments should come in on their parts. And why would they need a conductor? Well, the number of instruments more than doubled in size. The string sections all had more instruments, and not only were there now two of the flutes, oboes, and trumpets, but they also added the instruments of bassoons, French horns, and timpani. In the early 1800s, the Romantic era of orchestral music began and continued into the early 1900s. This is the period of music, art, and literature that is often characterized by the unabashed expression of emotion. Again, the orchestra grew its size and added instruments. Trombones and tuba were now part of the brass section. Clarinets joined the woodwind section. All kinds of percussion joined the timpani, and there were even harps. Romantic era symphonies and other works are very rich and full in sound with this large orchestra. Finally, in the early 1900s and through today is the period of music called the modern era, which is often characterized by musical innovation, breaking the rules of musical composition, and new and different sounds. The modern era orchestra is similar in size to the Romantic era orchestra, though the seating is rearranged a bit. So, let's review the four eras. The Baroque era of music was a great time of grand, fancy, and almost decorated sounding music, with a frivolous use of frills, trills, and extra notes. In the classical era, music was very structured and orderly. In the Romantic era, music was characterized by an unabashed expression of emotion. Finally, the modern era is characterized by musical innovation. Danke. Thank you for joining me on the Composer Detective today. Please join me to learn about great composers from all these orchestral eras.